There's something very interesting we see when you look at some of the organizations and teams and companies around the world. It's very simple. That when they reach the top of their field, things seem to fall out from under them. I think of Apple some 40 years ago. Many of you might have an iPhone in your purse or in your pocket right now, but 40 years ago, Apple revolutionized the computer industry with a device called the Apple II. And things were growing great for Apple. They were on top of the world, but they never adapted. They never continued to make good products, and so the things came crashing down. And Steve Jobs, the founder, was fired, and they spent 20 years in a barren wasteland trying to figure out what to do next. I think of so many sports teams that after a legend retires or a coach moves on, the team struggles. They never seem to make it back to that championship level. I think sometimes about churches. How in the 1960s there was a headline in the paper, the Churches of Christ are the fastest growing religious body in America. And yet today, if you look at the statistics, numerically at least, we're on the decline. And I think it works that way in our own lives, that sometimes in our own lives that when we're on top of the world, when we're successful, things sometimes come crashing down from underneath us. Maybe it's we have a great semester at school and we think we can kind of coast a little bit, and what happens the next semester? Well, it's not as easy. Our grades aren't as good. Or maybe we're having that talk with our spouse and we're sitting there going, you know what, it's been a while since we have a nice knock-down, drag-out fight. We haven't had one of those in a while. Well, if you're married, you know that Murphy's Law is going to happen. At some point in the next week, you're probably going to have a nice fight with your wife or your husband. Sometimes when we're on top of the world and our lives, things tend to come crashing down. And I think that's because success can be deadly. As one football coach put it, success is kind of like rat poison. It may taste good going down, but eventually it's going to kill you. You see, success is seductive. It makes us think that we've arrived. It makes us think that no one can beat us. It makes us think that we're on top of the world. It makes us think we can do it alone. It makes us think that we can live without God. And that's what we see here in the life of Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26. You know, we've spent the last couple of months reading through 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles in our daily Bible reading. And let's just be honest for a second. When we get to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, a lot of us probably observe what I like to call the Passover. Because there are a lot of funny names and a lot of weird stories and a lot of things going on there we're not sure what to do with. After all, it's history, and not all of us love history. But it's also a fascinating book. I love 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. There's a lot of cool stories in there, a lot of interesting people. But before we dive into this text that we're probably not super familiar with, let's set the context. You see, Uzziah, like so many of us here, I think everyone can say this, had a father. And his father's name was Amaziah. And Amaziah, his father, did what was right in God's eyes. He was mostly a good king. But when we look at Amaziah's life there in 2 Chronicles 25, we see that he still had some problems. He still had some issues. That even though he loved God, even though he wanted to serve God, he didn't do it with his whole heart. In a lot of ways, Amaziah is like us. That we love God, we want to serve God, but sometimes there's little idols in our hearts that we can't seem to put away. And that was the case in Amaziah's life. That he went away in an interesting story there in 2 Chronicles 25 and fought against Edom. And you know what Amaziah did after beating Edom? He took Edom's little idols, put them on a cart, and took them back to Jerusalem so he could worship them. You know, if I'm going to worship a God, it's not going to be of the people I just defeated. That doesn't make sense to me, because if Edom's gods aren't strong enough to protect Edom, they're probably not strong enough to worship. But that's what was going through Amaziah's mind there in 2 Chronicles 25. You see, Amaziah has some issues with idolatry in his life. And as a result of his idolatry and as a result of some poor decisions that he makes in his life, war breaks out between Judah, the southern kingdom that Amaziah ruled over, and the northern kingdom of Israel. And the southern kingdom is actually defeated. And Amaziah is carried off there in 2 Chronicles 25 into captivity, where he spends 15 years in the northern kingdom. He lives in exile. And when he's finally released and he finally goes home, they give him a nice welcoming party. In fact, they love that he's back so much they assassinate him. And after assassinating Amaziah, they make his son Uzziah king. That's what's going on when Uzziah becomes king here in 2 Chronicles 26. And overall, as we look through his story and the story of his life in 2 Chronicles 6 and the parallel passage there in 2 Kings, Uzziah, is a fairly good king. He's a pretty good king. But what we see there in his life is that sometimes good isn't good enough. And so tonight what we're going to do is just make two simple observations, two simple lessons from the life and legacy of Uzziah. Two lessons that I hope will help us in our walk with God. Two warnings maybe, that maybe will help us stay humble when we're on top of the world. You see, as we talked about just a moment ago, Uzziah, when he becomes king, things aren't going well. His dad has just been assassinated. They've just lost a battle. Things aren't going well in Judah. And to make matters worse, Uzziah, 2 Chronicles 26 tells us, is only 16 years old. Now, I don't know about you. When I was 16, I wasn't fit to run a Wendy's, much less run an entire kingdom. And as much as I love our teenagers, I'm not quite ready to see any one of them in the Oval Office. And yet, when we look at 2 Chronicles 26, that's where Uzziah finds himself at the ripe old age of 16. He's young, he's inexperienced, his country's in a crisis, and yet when we open to the account of his life there in 2 Chronicles 26, he's 16 and he's a king. And it's his job to lead, and he has a lot of work to do to rebuild Judah. And look how his tenure as king is described there in verse 4. It's described there in verse 4 as he did what was right in the Lord's sight, just as his father Amaziah had done. Now, I realize I'm pretty new to this parenting game, but those of you who have been parents substantially longer than I am, which is probably all of you, you're sitting here and you're wondering, man, I would love for my kid to have the exact same thing said about them, that they did what was right in God's eyes. And on top of that, as we look at Uzziah's life here in the text, we find out that he's incredibly successful. That he's not only a godly guy in the first half of the chapter, he's a successful guy. But the key to his success was not his intelligence. The key to his success was not his hard work. The key to his success was not great advisors, a good cabinet. The key to success was not an economy or a military. The key to his success, verse 5 tells us, was God. Look there in the text on how it says there in verse 5 that he sought God throughout the lifetime of Zechariah, the teacher of the fear of God. During the time that he sought the Lord, God gave him the success. And that's really the first lesson we need to learn from Uzziah's life, is that success is God-given. You know, on the surface, as we read the account of his life, he seems like a pretty good king. He seems like a king any one of us would like to have rule over us, perhaps maybe even serve as president of our country. In fact, as we read his life there in the chapter, we see a list of things that he did to build back Judah after they had been beaten and knocked down from the top of the world. There in verse 6 and 7, it's described how he went to wage war against the Philistines, basically the rivals of Judah, and he's victorious, and he knocked down the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod. He built cities in the vicinity of Ashdod and among the Philistines. God helped him there against the Philistines and the Arabs that live in Jubal and the Mennonites and the Ammonites. Another rival of Judah paid tribute to Uzziah, and his fame spread as far as the entrance of Egypt. For God made him very powerful. You know, that's the third time in our text, in our study this evening, that the writer of 2 Chronicles tells us that it was God who gave Uzziah success. But he wasn't just successful militarily. He also did a great job of building towers, verse 9, in Jerusalem and at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and the corner butters. He fortified them. And he also didn't just build towers and fortify the city. He had many cattle in the foothills and in the plains. So he built towers in the desert. He built wells in the desert. And since he was a lover of soil, he had many farmers and vine dressers in the hills and the fertile lands. This is a man who's very industrious. He's not only a great commander of the army, he's also great at building things. But that's not all. So he's not just great at commanding and winning wars, he's great at organizing the army. In fact, there in verse 11, he has an army that's equipped for combat and went out to war by divisions, as recorded there by Jeiel and the court secretary in verse 11, and Maaseiah, the officer under the authority of Hananiah, one of the king's commanders. The total number of warriors was 2,600 valiant warriors. And usually when I see the word valiant warriors or mighty men in my Old Testament, the vision that comes to my mind is Navy SEALs or ancient Navy SEALs. Those are the best of the best of the best soldiers there. So he is a nice little special operations unit. But under their authority was an army of 307,500 men equipped for combat. A powerful force to help the king against the enemy. Uzziah had such great military strength that he had 307,000 guys. That's a lot of guys ready to go to war at any given moment. That's a pretty big army, not only by today's standards, but that was a huge army by the ancient world standards. And so he has everything you want in a king. He's good with money. He's great at building things. He's a great military commander. He wins wars. He organizes the army effectively. He equips them effectively. He has everything you want in a king. And when we read his story up to this point, he gets off to a really good start. There's a lot to like about him. He's a good leader. He's an effective leader. He's a good king. But what we find out in Uzziah's life is that as good as he wasn't good enough. He still fell short. You see, something happened to Uzziah as he was on top of the world. When he reached the pinnacle of his profession, as it were, something went wrong. There in verse 15, it tells us that his fame spread to distant places, for he was wondrously helped until he became strong. You see, at the climax of Isaiah's story is a huge warning for all of us that God was with him until he became strong. Uzziah was at the top of his game. He had great power, a great army, a great military, great cities, fortified cities. No one could defeat him. He had achieved great things for the people of God. So where in the world did things go wrong for Uzziah? Where did things go sideways? Why in the world was God no longer with him when he became strong? To put it short, as we're going to find out in just a second, he didn't continue to follow God. You see, at some point in Uzziah's reign, Uzziah forgot that his success ultimately came from God. His pride swelled, his ego was inflated, he forgot the Lord, and he fell away from God. Maybe we're sitting here and we're wondering, how in the world could such a good king, such a good man, such an effective leader go wrong? I mean, he's got everything going for him. Where did he go sideways? Well, if we go all the way back to verse 5, we get a little snapshot, a little peek in something wrong in his life, a little hint. He sought God, there, verse 5, throughout the lifetime of Zechariah, the teacher of the fear of God. That as I read that, at least, that Isaiah's faith wasn't his own. It was Zechariah's. And as good as Isaiah was, he still needed someone to guide him. He still needed someone to teach him. He still needed someone to mentor him. He still needed someone to confront him when he was wrong. And once that mentor and teacher, Zechariah, was gone, once Zechariah passed away, he lost his way. And when he had become strong, his ego, his pride, he forgot about God. You know, nothing has changed even in our world today. That we still need godly mentors and friends to call us out on our mistakes. We need people to push us. We need people to guide us. We need people to hold us accountable when we make mistakes. You see, when Isaiah lost his friend and his mentor and his teacher there in the text, it affected his walk with God. He lost the person that kept him accountable. And somewhere along the way, his heart was filled with pride. His success and his strength went to his head, and he stopped serving God completely. You see, forgetting that success comes from God is a pathway that leads us to unfaithfulness and ruin in our life. That's the lesson I think we can learn from Isaiah's life. And so when we're on top of the world, when things are going right, when we've got that promotion at work, when things are going great in our marriage, when things are going great in our church, who do we give credit for? Do we look to God and say, God, thank you for this success. Thank you for the promotion. Thank you for a peaceful marriage. Thank you for the growth at church. Or do we say, look at all the stuff we're doing. Look at all the stuff I'm doing. Look how great I am. What we need to remember in our own life is that any success we may enjoy in this life ultimately comes from God. And so we need to put away pride, submit to God, and trust in God, and remember that He is the key to success. And yet, when we look at Isaiah's life, as his story continues there in the chapters, he's sitting on the throne enjoying all of his successes. Maybe he's sitting there thinking to himself, wow, it's so great to be king. Look at my army. Look at my economy. Look at my city. Look at my towers. Look at everything going on around me. I'm on top of the world. I have the Midas touch. Everything I touch, everything I do turns to gold. But when we turn over to that parallel passage in 2 Kings, we're not going to go there. I'm just going to make a quick reference there. We see something is wrong, something is rotten in the state of Judah. You see, 2 Kings chapter 15 tells us that Isaiah never removed the high places. And those high places are usually places that you would worship idols. And so as good as he was, as effective as he was, as godly as he was, Isaiah never got rid of those places where people worshiped idols. I think this is a subtle hint that he didn't do quite everything God wanted his kings to do. That as good as Isaiah was, he wasn't good enough. He wasn't perfect. He had some pretty serious flaws. Look how the story continues there in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, beginning in verse 16. The text tells us there that when he became strong, he grew arrogant. And it led to his own destruction. He acted unfaithfully against the Lord, his God, by going into the Lord's sanctuary to burn incense on the incense altar. The priest Azariah, along with 80 brave priests of the Lord, went in after him. They took their stand against King Uzziah and said, Uzziah, you have no right to offer incense to the Lord. Only the consecrated priests to the Lord, only the descendants of Aaron have the right to offer incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have acted unfaithfully. You will not receive honor from the Lord God. Got to admire their bravery there, talking to the king like that. But look there in verse 19. Uzziah, with a fire pan in his hand to offer incense, was enraged. But when he became enraged with the priest in the presence of the priest in the Lord's temple beside the altar of incense, a skin disease, your translation may say leprosy, broke out on his forehead. Then Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests turned to him and saw that he was diseased on his forehead. They rushed him out of there, and he himself hurried to get out because the Lord had afflicted him. After a lifetime of faithfully serving the Lord, Uzzah sinned. He went where he shouldn't go. He offered sacrifices, which is something he shouldn't do as king. He ignored God's commands, went into the temple, offered a sacrifice himself, which was something only those priests, as Azariah pointed out, were meant to do. And what we saw there in the text is that one sin, that one mistake, that one time his pride got the better of him, meant that he spent the rest of his life alone, isolated, away from the temple, away from the opportunity to worship God, away from his family, away from his duties as king, all because of that one mistake. All because of that one time pride got the better of him. So what can we learn from Uzziah's mistake? We'll look there at verse 16. When he became strong, he grew arrogant, and it led to his own destruction. 2 Kings 26 and verse 16 reminds us that pride goes before the fall. If success is God-given, we need to remember the source of all of our success, and that's God. And when we get strong in our head and we get prideful in our head, we forget God. And that's really what the second lesson we can learn from Uzziah's life is that success can also be dangerous. Because it's when we're at the top of the game, the top of the hill, the king of the mountain, that's those times in our life when we're so tempted to forget about God. You see, somewhere along the way in his life, Uzziah forgot that it was God who gave him success. And it was God who made him strong. And isn't that the case with us? When we look at our own lives and our own hearts, how many times in our life have we forgotten that our success comes from God? That's a real danger for all of us, but yet that's what pride does. Pride makes us shift our confidence from God to us. Pride makes us harden our heart. Pride makes us stubborn and rebellious. That's what we see from Uzziah there in the text. That yes, he's making this mistake. Yes, he's sinning there in verse 18 and 19. And when he's confronted, at least in my opinion, is my judgment, had he gone, you know what, priest, you're right. I shouldn't be doing this. Will you offer this sacrifice for me? There's a possibility that God may have extended some grace and not struck him with leprosy. But what does he do? He gets mad. He gets angry. It's after he gets mad, after he gets angry, that God strikes him with the leprosy. He's punished, and he has to spend the rest of his life in isolation. That's what pride does. Pride destroys. You see there in the text, Uzziah knew he was violating the law. Uzziah knew he had no right to offer sacrifices. Uzziah knew that the priests were right to confront him about offering sacrifices. But what we realize sometimes in our life is that there's a certain level of insanity behind each and every sin that we do. Because we know what God's word says. We just want to do it our way. We want to do what we want to do when we want to do it. So we sin. And at this point in his life, Uzziah seems to have lost his mind. He is so filled with pride that he can't recognize the sin in his life. He's so filled with pride that he can't recognize that the priests are actually trying to do him good. He's so filled with pride that he can't realize that he is defying the very God he is trying to worship. And yet, as we look at Uzziah's life and his pride there in the text, I see three warnings for us. That pride leads to sin. Really deep down to it, pride is behind every sin that we commit. behind every sin that we commit in this life, whatever that sin may be, is a little bit of pride where we're telling God, I know better than you. Pride leads us to tell God, the very God who created us, the very God who knows everything, the very God who knows what's best for us, it leads us to tell him, I know better. I'm going to do it my way. But sometimes pride also leads us to ignore correction. You see, when we become powerful, when we become successful like Uzziah, we start to think that we've got it all figured out, that we're accountable to no one, that I'm successful because of my hard work. I got this promotion because I worked hard for 10 years, that my intelligence got me this far. And we stop listening to the counsel of others. That's what happened to Uzziah here in the text, that he got angry at the priests and ignored their correction. And that leads us to the third lesson we can learn from Uzziah, and that's that pride leads to God's judgment. In Uzziah's case, he was struck with leprosy and forced to live the rest of his life unable to worship God in the temple again. But here's what makes pride so dangerous. So dangerous in the life of Uzziah, so dangerous even in our hearts today, is that pride begins in the heart. Pride grows in the heart long before it shows up in our actions. Which means we probably need to take a long, hard look at our hearts and see if our hearts, even tonight, may be filled with pride. Because much like Uzziah, we are really successful. Most of us, if not all of us here, have been blessed by God on a level not seen by many people around the world. If you look at the world's wealth, we're probably in the top 1% just by living here in America. We're blessed. We drove here today in cars, but not just cars. I'm going to guess here in Texas, when it's 106 degrees out there, most of you had air conditioning. And not only that, we're sitting here on a Sunday night when it's 106 outside, and we got fans going. We have air conditioning blowing. That's something some people in the other parts of the world don't enjoy. We are incredibly blessed. We're wealthy. Most of us live very comfortable lives by the rest of the world's standards. And so it's really easy for us, even today, to sit here and go and look around at all the blessings we have and think that it's all by our work and all by our efforts that we are successful. But really, that's just the pride in our heart talking. And that's what makes success so dangerous. That we start to believe that we've earned it. We start to believe that we deserve it. That's when, in our pride, our hearts are hardened by the deceitfulness of sin and we turn away from God. And that's why Uzziah's story, Uzziah's life should be a wake-up call for all of us. Because the thing that we want most in this life, success and blessings, can be the one thing that actually turns us away from God. I mean, how many of us in our own life and the own opportunities that we've had in our life have, when we reach the top of our game, when we got that promotion at work, when things are going great in our marriage like we've talked about several times tonight, when things are going great in our life, go, I've got it right. I've got it all going on. I've got it all figured out. It's by my work and by my effort that I've achieved this. How many times in our life have we been filled with pride when we're on top of the world? That's why Uzziah's life should be a lesson for all of us. And so one thing we need to remember in our life as we look at Uzziah's life is that pride always goes before the fall. That's what we see over and over and over again in the Bible, is that when people are on top of the world, that's when they fall. But in contrast to that, what would happen to our life if we let God control our life? What would happen if we remembered that the one who gave us success is God? How would that change how we spent our careers? How would that change what we did in retirement? How would that change our families and relationships? How would that change how we used our possessions and how we spent our money? How much different would we live if we realized the source of all of our success was God? That the very careers that we work out, the very retirement accounts that we have, the pensions that we may have from our previous work, that everything we have in this life, from the air that we breathe, to the roof over our heads, to the cars that we drive, is the result and a blessing from God. Uzziah forgot that. Uzziah was a good king, but he wasn't good enough. But later down the line, there was another good king. In fact, he was a perfect king. He came to earth, lived that perfect life, and died there on the cross. See, Jesus was the king that we all needed. Because where Uzziah wasn't good enough, Christ is more than good enough. He was perfect. And despite his sinless perfection, he died there on the cross. So you and I, despite our pride, despite our wickedness, despite our sin, can look back to God and say, God, I am sorry. I am in need of grace. I am in need of forgiveness. I am in need of your love. Can I come back to you? Maybe you're here tonight and you're in need of grace. You're ready to turn back to God, broken of your pride and humbled by his love. And you're ready to become his child again tonight. If we can help you with that, please let us know while together we stand and sing.